So maybe a couple more words about me and my background for those of you who don't know me, so you know why I chose to present this topic. This coming Tuesday, I will celebrate my 40th anniversary at SAS. So thank you. We're done here. Thank you so much. So I've always been in R&D, all 40 years. I started working on the SAS Micro-to-Host Link, which a year or two later became SAS Connect, which many of you may be familiar with. That led to my team developing SAS Grid Manager and many years of enhancing that and supporting that. So that pretty much took up probably the first 30-ish years of the 40. And then I moved on to lead the visualization division with teams that support and develop SAS Studio, SAS Visual Analytics, SAS Enterprise Guide, and we started the migration team to help with the migration from SAS 9 to VIA. And then about 3 years ago, I joined the team I'm in now, Applied Architecture and Technology, which is just a kind of a fancy way of saying we work with our most strategic customers to help you be successful in your move to VIA. So I love technology. I have lots of years of background in the technology, and I love the migration topic and how to help you get from your SAS 9 environments to VIA. So I've had several questions about workload management on VIA. Is there a grid on VIA? So I'm hoping this presentation will answer a lot of those questions. And then, again, I'm happy to entertain any questions at the end of the talk. So this is the agenda of what we will be covering and what we won't be covering. So first, we'll go over a little background, a little history of the products on SAS 9. Then we'll talk about migration of the grid configuration, migration of batch SAS jobs, migration of parallel SAS jobs, and then migration of scheduled SAS jobs. So these are all things that are specific to a grid deployment. We'll also give some consideration. All of these are jobs, meaning they're SAS code, and what are some considerations you need to think about in that regard. What we'll not be talking about is the migration of any other SAS 9 products that you're running on the grid, like SAS Data Integration Studio, SAS Enterprise Guide, SAS Enterprise Miner. All of those have migration tooling and options in place, but it's just too broad of a topic to cover in 45 minutes. How many of you can relate to this? Personally, yeah, I see heads nodding. Personally and professionally. Just too many things coming at you all at once. Too many jobs. I mean, you need to prioritize. You need to automate what you can. And this holds in your businesses and your daily work as well. This is why so many of our customers and many of you in this room chose to run SAS 9 with SAS Grid Manager, to get the prioritization, to get the workload balancing, to be able to schedule jobs in an automated and organized way, to get rid of this chaos. So let's start with the background, some history first. We actually had 3 flavors of SAS Grid on SAS 9. The one we will be focusing on today is SAS Grid Manager for Platform. That is based on the platform suite for SAS. It originally was called SAS Grid Manager, but when we wrote our own, listed in the middle box there, we took the name SAS Grid Manager for our internally written SAS Workload Orchestrator and just tacked for platform on the end of the other product. The SAS Grid Manager was released with 9.4M6 all the way back in 2018. So it's been around for a little bit, SAS Workload Orchestrator. That was the first version of it on SAS 9, and that became the workload management that we're going to be talking about for VIA. And then the last one was just sort of a, every now and then in technology you make a mistake. We did SAS Grid Manager for Hadoop based on Yarn and Oozie. Yarn is not a good workload manager for batch types of workload. So that's a product that we no longer offer, but I put it on there for completeness in case any of you were aware of it. So what's in SAS Grid Manager for Platform? Again, it's based on what we call the platform suite for SAS, which is made up of 2 main components. load sharing facility, or something you probably have heard referred to as LSF. Its job is to dispatch workload into the grid, keep a status of that workload, manage all the resources that are across the grid, and load balance the jobs. And all of this is done through the use of queuing and prioritization. So you set up queues for the workload to go into. There are specifications around those queues about which ones should be scheduled first, which resources are needed by the jobs in those queues, things like that. And then the second piece that some people don't think about or don't remember is Platform Process Manager. That's the scheduler that came with SAS Grid and the Platform Suite for SAS. So its job was to manage job dependencies and triggers. And so whenever those dependencies were met, Process Manager would hand the work over to LSF so LSF could decide where to run it on the grid. So they worked hand in hand. But to say you scheduled jobs with LSF is not really true. Process Manager was the scheduler with SAS Grid Manager for Platform, or it is the scheduler. There were a couple of clients that came with it that could be used, Flow Manager to give a visual representation of the flows, and Calendar Editor in case you wanted to create custom calendars based on your organization's needs. Let's compare that to SAS VIO Workload Management. How do those pieces and parts compare? Again, SAS Workload Orchestrator, I mentioned that earlier. It originated on SAS 9 with SAS Grid Manager back in 2018. It was then ported and adapted to VIA when we came out with VIA. What does it do? A lot of the same things as LSF. Dispatches work to the resources in the cluster, manages those resources, reports on the status of the jobs. And again, it's all done through the same setup of queues and priorities and resource specifications on those queues. The thing that's new about SAS Workload Orchestrator on VIA is that it extends the scheduling capabilities of Kubernetes. And that gives us a nice special feature we'll talk about a little later in the presentation. The other big difference with VIO Workload Management is it does not come with an enterprise scheduler. SAS has never written our own enterprise scheduler. We have a basic scheduler that can do basic things similar to cron and other basic schedulers you may be familiar with, but we don't have an enterprise scheduler with SAS Workload Orchestrator. We'll be talking about what the options are, and they're basically two. You may already have your own enterprise scheduler that you use in your organization. You can continue to use that with your workload in VIA. Or Apache Airflow is a choice that a lot of our customers have made and a lot of our hosted managed customers are running in order to do their scheduling in VIA. I put this table together because I think it gives a nice summary and side-by-side comparison of how SAS Grid Manager for Platform compares to SAS Workload Orchestrator on VIA. So the SAS 9 column is, so this represents SAS Grid Manager for Platform. This column is SAS Workload Management on VIA. So the first three, they're very equal. They all do multi-user workload balancing and parallel workload balancing, centralized workload monitoring management. They start to differ there in the fourth row with centralized management and monitoring for all jobs. Those of you who have SAS Grid Manager for Platform probably are aware you could purchase a full license from IBM and use it to manage all workload in your grid, not just SAS workload. That's not true on the VIA side because SAS Workload Orchestrator is a SAS-authored component, and it only knows how to interact with other SAS components. Distributed enterprise scheduling, we just talked about that. High availability, that was a very big selling point for SAS Grid Manager as well. The Ego capability within Platform Suite for SAS enabled high availability for things like the object spawner and the SAS metadata server and things like that. This topic isn't really applicable to workload management for VIA because it's an inherent functionality of Kubernetes. So you have high availability just through the Kubernetes infrastructure within the VIA deployment. Auto scaling, both up and down. This is where SAS Workload Orchestrator on VIA really starts to shine. We could not do that in SAS 9. Partly, you normally had a physical set of hardware, but we just didn't have the capability to do it. With Kubernetes underneath, SAS Workload Orchestrator is able to integrate with the cluster autoscaler and scale node pools up, either when when workload gets bigger, or you can configure at 9 o'clock in the morning when everybody comes in. I know I'm going to need more resources, and so you can do it on a time basis. So that's a really great feature and functionality with the SAS VIA workload management. The last one is interesting too, because SAS Workload Orchestrator on VIA is included with your VIA order, and it's enabled by default. SAS Grid for platform was always an additionally licensed product, and you had to install and configure it. SAS Workload Orchestrator is there, and it has an out-of-the-box minimal configuration. So even if you have VIA deployed, you might say, I'm not using SAS Workload Orchestrator, but in fact you really are, because every SAS instantiation in VIA will go through SAS Workload Orchestrator with the single default queue and single default host type that we'll talk about here in a minute. So when you start talking about moving between 9 and VIA, I think it's helpful to look at the various ways you can submit work to the grid. So in SAS 9, for SAS Grid Manager for Platform, one option is to use the grid service enable data step function. That actually, under the covers, will use SAS Connect to call LSF. Another way would be to run batch jobs, and that was through the SAS gsub client utility, which we'll call LSF under the covers to actually put the job on the grid and decide where to run it. Grid-launched workspace servers. Again, the object spawner in SAS 9 will call LSF under the covers to decide where to instantiate that object spawner. And scheduled jobs. As we discussed, Process Manager, once the triggers are met, will call LSF under the covers to actually schedule and run the job on the grid resources. So we see a pattern here, right? Everything's calling LSF. We have a single traffic cop on a SAS 9 grid, and in fact, a lot of our customers would disable interactive logons. They really wanted to lock down those grid resources so that only LSF was deciding where things would run and when they would run. This takes the same look, a very similar look, at SAS workload management on VIA. So we still have SAS code, as we've said many times at the various booths that you visited the last couple of days. Hopefully you have heard this message. 98% of the SAS code you have in SAS 9 will run in the programming environment of VIA. And so if you have programs where you've added grid service enable in SAS 9, they will continue to run with SAS Workload Orchestrator in VIA. In this case, on the VIA side, it uses SAS Connect to launch a Connect server. Batch jobs use the VIA CLI to launch a batch job. SAS Command uses SAS Connect to launch a Connect server. You see a pattern here. We're launching everything. Scheduled jobs. If you use Airflow or a third-party scheduler, Airflow calls back into the VIA CLI to launch a compute server to run the job that you have scheduled. And if you use a third-party scheduler, you would use the batch CLI to launch a batch job. So everything launches. It goes through the launcher, which is a component of SAS VIA. In many of my slides, I will have links to documentation at the bottom, because many of these topics are deep topics that you may want to have more detail and more information about. So I tried to include the links to make it easy for you to find additional information as we go throughout the presentation, and you'll have this presentation afterwards. So VIA is a little different because we actually have a series of traffic cops. We have SAS Workload Orchestrator, and we could have some configuration within the scheduler. For example, Airflow configuration lets you specify how many concurrent jobs you want to run at any given time. And these all layer on top of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is the final decision maker, but it's important to know that they all kind of coordinate together. So just to summarize this background, I put together a couple of very high-level architecture slides. I think I created this slide 25 years ago, but it's still accurate. So for SAS Grid Manager for Platform, the red circle shows the server tier, which is really where Platform LSF is running and where the workload is being managed. So that's really the heart of what we're doing here with the workload management. Of course, we have the client tier to submit work to the grid, web server, clustered web server, possibly clustered metadata, doesn't have to be, could use the SAS Grid to provide high availability there, and then any data sources off to the right, left. So compare and contrast this with, again, a very high-level VIA architecture slide. We have web apps and things that will submit work to the compute node pool. That's where SWO is doing its thing on the compute node pool. It's keeping track of what resources are available, what resources are used, what resources are being requested, and load balancing the work across that compute area. And then, of course, we have our stateful node pool and CAS node pool off to the side. But workload management doesn't have any interaction with the CAS cluster. Okay, so let's start talking about these pieces that are specific to a SAS Grid deployment and how we go about migrating them and kind of the benefit we get from doing that. I mentioned already that SAS Workload Orchestrator is part of a VIA deployment. There's no additional charge. It's enabled out of the box with default minimum configuration, interacts with everything that goes through Launcher, as we talked about in a previous slide. And to prove it to yourself, you can go into your VIA deployment and find the SWO dashboard, which will show out of the box a single default queue and a single default host type. So let's look at that dashboard and give you an idea of what you can expect when you go looking for it. This is just the main entry part of the dashboard. It's part of Environment Manager. If you go into SAS Environment Manager and look for the monitor section, you will see Workload Orchestrator, and that's how you bring this view up. It just gives you some very basic information. There's a queue status and a host status. This is out of the box, so there's not a lot here to look at, really. If we go across the tabs at the top, I just went from dashboard to jobs. You see a list. I've selected all jobs, and so you see a list of jobs. I just put some in there with various states, whether they're running or completed, so you can see the state, the user that submitted it, the name. Of course, you can grow these columns so you can see the full text in the column. What queue it came out of? It came out of the default queue because out of the box, that's the only queue we have. And then moving across to the queue tab, we see, again, just one queue defined. It's the default queue. It has a priority of 10. Not very meaningful because if you only have one, it's always going to schedule out of there first. And then other, maximum jobs that can be run out of that queue, some other statistics about the queue. And then lastly, looking at the host tab, we see our one default host, which is open. It can run a maximum of 250 jobs concurrently. It is our default. So that's what you'll see. You'll see something very similar if you go to this dashboard in your VIA deployment, because this gets set up by default. So what do I mean when I talk about migrating the SAS grid configuration? Well, those of you who are familiar with LSF know that there's a whole series of files that have information about the queue names and the queue properties and the various hosts that are in the grid and various user groups that can use the host, all kinds of different information. So the 5 files that I have listed here are the 5 that are important when migrating the LSF configuration over to a SAS workload orchestrator configuration. So the host queues, parameters, users, and the LSF cluster file. So if we look at this slide, and remember, in SAS 9, you have a set of physical machines. You know, you may have, I don't know, 12 machines in your SAS grid. You may have 20. In a VIA deployment, you don't have physical machines. It's in the cloud. It's Kubernetes. It's not physical machines with actual host names that stay long term. So when we think about migrating the LSF configuration, some of it's easy, some other of it is just you have to think about a little more. The queues are easy. You just migrate the LSF queue definitions over to SWO queue definitions, and you get the same queue names and priorities, and we'll see that in just a minute. Because we're dealing with Kubernetes and not physical permanent host names, the host file from LSF and the cluster file are parsed, and the various hosts are grouped together, the hosts that have the same configuration and properties. And then for every group, a host type is created on the SAS workload orchestrator side. Some parameters, LSF has so many different parameters and features and functionality. Some of them are not supported by SAS workload orchestrator, or they don't even make sense in a Kubernetes cloud deployment. So those parameters are discarded. I will say, once you do this migration, this is like the first step of configuring your SAS workload orchestrator environment. It gets what you had in LSF defined on the SWO side, but then you need to look at it and decide, do I need all those queues? Do I need additional queues? Should I be changing some priority? Do I need more host types so that I can do node scaling and things like that? How do we get that information over? Well, we use the SAS workload orchestrator CLI, and I have 2 examples shown on this slide. There are 2 sources for this information. You can either point it to the platform web services web app to get the information, and that is shown by saying config grid import from PWS, or you can point to the LSF configuration directory, and if your VIA deployment does not have access to it, you can just copy this over someplace where VIA does have access to it. They're just files on the file system. And then we would change the grid config to import from LSF configdir. And it will parse those files and go through the steps that we just covered in the previous slide and create the configuration on the SWO side. Another link, there's more detail. You might want to know what are the arguments that can be specified, things like that. So the link at the bottom will give you more detail. There's some additional SAS 9 configuration that should be migrated that is important when you set up your SWO environment, and that would be your SAS Connect server definitions out of metadata and your SAS Grid server definitions that are defined in SAS metadata. These are used to create batch and launcher contexts that are used by SAS workload orchestrator. So it just provides the parameters and things to set the environment when things run through SAS workload orchestrator. And hopefully, over the last couple of days, or even before, all of you have heard some mention about SAS content assessment. SAS content assessment is really where you start when you start planning your SAS 9 migration to VIA. What it does is it just looks at your SAS 9 environment and collects all kinds of information about the content you have there and how many of them and how much of it will migrate one for one over to VIA and things like that. The utilities within SAS 9 content assessment that are important for grid customers, I mean, this is a repeat. Everybody wants to do inventory, profile, code check, publish, but also create SAS grid import data and import grid packages are important to run out of content assessment when you are migrating from SAS Grid Manager over to VIA workload management. So here's a screenshot actually of I did a migration of a customer's LSF directory, and this is what I got after doing that migration. We see they had a total of 10 queues and they all came over. We'll see the full list in just a minute. So, you know, we have the queues shown up here because this is just the main dashboard summarizing everything. And we can't fit them all in. There's a scroll bar over here if this were live, and then host status for the one host that we have. If we drill down into the queues, so I just went to the queue tab here, we'll see the 10 queues that were defined on the SAS 9 side. And we see that we brought over, well, they're all open and active because nothing's running right now, but we brought over the priority, and any other information that may have been defined with those queues would be brought over as well and put in the queue definitions on the VIA side. And this is then when you would sit down and say, okay, do I need all 10 of these? Do they make sense in VIA? Do I need some additional queues? Do I need to modify some priorities? That's what I mean when I say migrating the configuration is really your starting point. So let's talk about migration of batch SAS jobs, another type of workload on a grid. With SAS Grid Manager, you run SAS batch jobs with the batch client utility, which is SAS GSub. What that does is it submits SAS programs or R Python programs, open source programs to the grid, interactive sessions, views the status of those jobs, and just overall manages the life cycle of those batch jobs. There's a sample command of SAS GSub. We are submitting this program, report.sas, with this path name, and we're specifying the grid job options of the overnight queue. Again, for additional information about all of the various parameters and modes that can be supported by SAS GSub, you can click on this link at the bottom. So how do we do this same thing with Workload Orchestrator? You absolutely can. It's not using SAS GSub, but it's the exact same concept using the VIA batch jobs command. It does, as I said, the same thing. Submits SAS programs, Python and R, launches batch servers that then get managed by SAS Workload Orchestrator, and can start interactive sessions and have full lifecycle interaction and management of these jobs. Slightly different syntax here. This is the SAS VIA batch jobs command, where you still specify which program you want to run, myprogram.sas with this path, and a server context here specified as default. Moving on to parallel SAS jobs. Well, what is a parallel SAS job, first of all? Lots of times you will have SAS code that will have independent units of work that could be run in parallel. And the reason you would want to run those in parallel is because you can drastically speed up the overall the time that it takes to run that overall program. You do that by surrounding those independent tasks with an rsubmit and rsubmit block, and then you use the grid service enable data step function call to tell SAS, I want all of these parallel jobs that are in between the rsubmit and rsubmit to be submitted to SAS Grid Manager and run on the grid. This is an example of a parallel job. I have the grid service enable at the top, and this is just saying I want all of my tasks to run on the grid using the SAS app server specification. This is SAS 9, of course. I used an auto sign-on option just to minimize the amount of code I needed to have on this slide. And what that means is when I hit an rsubmit, if I don't have a session called task 1, Connect automatically creates one for me. So I have task 1 that can be run in parallel, task 2 that can be run in parallel, task N, and then I want to wait for all of them to finish before I sign off or terminate all of those sessions. This program, provided you have a context on VIA named SAS app, will run without any change to it, except for if you have code in these parallel tasks, obviously pointing to data locations that have changed between SAS 9 and where your data lives on the VIA side. Other than that, the syntax of this program does not have to change. So I know I've gotten personally that question a lot for customers that have done a lot of parallelization of code. Can we still run this on VIA, or do we have to completely restructure it? And the answer is you can run it on VIA as long as you modify your data locations. And it is dependent on this server equal, this SAS app being a valid context on the VIA side. This kind of really restates some of what I just said. We already talked about grid service enable, saying run the sessions on the grid. Back to the compatibility, we have the argument server that was used in the SAS 9 code is not, doesn't really make a lot of sense on the VIA side, but it's aliased to context. So you don't have to change it. You just need to make sure that the context that you specify there is a valid context on the VIA side. Other parameters, there are a lot of other parameters you can specify on the grid service enable function call. Will run on the VIA side as well, provided the appropriate connect servers and grid server metadata have been migrated, as we talked about earlier. Okay, scheduled jobs. In SAS 9, the way you would schedule jobs with SAS Grid Manager is you would deploy the job for scheduling. And you would do that either using something like Data Integration Studio or SAS Management Console with the Schedule Manager plugin. And then you would use the Schedule Manager plugin to add the job to a flow. And a flow is nothing more than a series of jobs with all the triggers and scheduling information stored along with it. And then you would assign that flow, if you were using Platform Process Manager, you would assign it to that scheduling server so that when the triggers were met, Process Manager would hand that job over to LSF to decide where on the grid to run it. In VIA, you choose your enterprise scheduler. And again, I'm making a distinction between enterprise scheduler, meaning full-featured, being able to rerun from a certain point, lots of different logic that is used in the scheduler beyond just a basic run this job every third Wednesday of the month. We do have a very basic scheduler that can be used out of the box and to get you started. My caution is just make sure you understand that that is a basic scheduler, and if you get some more sophisticated requirements, you will need a more sophisticated scheduler to meet those requirements. We talked about the fact that you can choose your own enterprise scheduler and interface with the batch CLI, or you could choose to use Apache Airflow, and we do have a number of integrations that we've provided from SAS to facilitate the use of that component. So just one slide on Apache Airflow. It is a great tool for scheduling and monitoring custom workflows. It works on Python programs that create DAGs. And we have published the SAS Airflow provider, which is a component that connects to Airflow and allows you to add SAS jobs to an Airflow DAG or SAS Studio flows to an Airflow DAG. I have links at the bottom. This is the Git repository for Apache Airflow, and this is a link to the Git repository for the SAS Airflow provider that was written by SAS. We also have a number of other tools that facilitate the use of Airflow. Number one is migration tools that will will do a JExport and read the metadata from the process manager scheduled jobs and convert that over to Airflow DAGs. So you don't have to do anything manually. It all gets converted with the migration tools, similar to the SPKs and other packages that get created during the migration process and moved over. The migration team is working with a couple of large customers right now as we speak, using these tools to move their process manager jobs over to Airflow. And then once you're there, once you've migrated, your users are going to want to create more scheduled jobs. We have 3 really great custom steps within SAS Studio that allow you to initiate a DAG, add tasks or jobs, flows, Studio flows, or just SAS jobs to that DAG, and then finalize the Airflow DAG. So all that can be done through the Studio interface without any coding or knowledge of the Python code that is inside of the DAG definition of Airflow. So I made reference to this at the beginning. So we've talked about jobs, lots of SAS jobs. These are all SAS code. And SAS code is everywhere on SAS 9. I mean, we have customers with over 1 million SAS files, upwards of 2 million SAS files, because they've been using SAS for decades. So we have .sas files on the file system. They're embedded in some of our tooling, like SAS Data Integration Studio, SAS Enterprise Guide projects. You need to run content assessment. I can't stress how beneficial and necessary content assessment is in order to plan your migration from 9 to VIA. And it's downloadable off of our external website, and if you just type SAS content assessment into Google, you'll get all kinds of documentation and information about it if you don't already know. What it will do with this code is check for any procedures or statements that don't exist on VIA because they don't make sense. And it will look for any data sources or data output that you probably need to modify because you've moved your data over to VIA and the location is now different. We do not have migration tools that move the actual .sas files off of the file system. That's something that is up to you individually to decide how and where you want to copy those files to. So here we are, happy, organized, everything's scheduled, and hopefully now you feel some sense of relief, especially if you are familiar with the SAS Grid capabilities on SAS 9, that many, if not most, and even some additional capabilities exist on VIA. So you can do a lot of things to control your workloads, manage, prioritize, and be happy. Thank you. Jim.
Thank you, Cheryl. Excellent presentation. So in the grid service enable, I'm thinking that environment variables could also be used to populate. So if your path names for your locations of your source code, et cetera, that's something that's supported, in that you can pull back out of your environment the variables, the locations of the path names of the .sas code, et cetera?
So we do not support, Grid Service Enable doesn't specify where your code is. If you remember the rsubmit and darsubmit block, you could have a % include there if your file, your SAS code lives somewhere else.
But I'm thinking more of, can you pull an environment variable? Like in the Linux environment, we can actually query the value of an environment variable. Just want the same capability in VIA. You know, can you pull an environment variable so you can populate that? You know, in your grid service enable, you use a SAS macro variable. Can you populate that further on in your code, like in your include or your auto exec, you can populate that variable, right? That would be key. Then you don't have to change the code, is what I'm getting. All you have to change is your include or your auto exec.
Yes, but also I should have mentioned, along with content assessment, identifying the data locations in your code that may need attention. The migration team provides a mapping tool where you will say live name X on SAS 9 needs to map to this live name on VIA, and then you run that mapping tool and it will create new versions of your SAS code with the new locations in it. We don't modify your existing SAS code.
Let me
But
try.
if you're using macro variables will work. It just depends on where you have them. You have to be very careful with macro variables that are inside of an rsubmit to make sure they get resolved on the client side where your code actually is versus sent over to the
Well,
Connect
let me
server.
ask it a different way, then it might help clarify. Can you get the value, like from Linux, we can get the value of an environment variable and be usable in our SAS code? Is that capability available in VIA as well?
Do you want to help there, Jan?
Yeah, so that capability is certainly available. It's just the way that you define the environment variable is slightly different because you don't have an actual Linux system that you directly operate on. So there are various options. You can either specify it on the actual compute context on which your job is executing, or you could actually specify a custom template for the actual pod that gets scheduled on the nodes. So then basically you could say, well, if you have a common variable that you want to have everywhere, you could specify it on the actual pod definition and it will be included everywhere where you run it. Okay.
Thanks, Jan. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
A topic that we often run into is then the user IDs that jobs run under. If you have more like an interactive way of working with SAS GSUB or a Connect server session, then it typically runs under the user ID of the person submitting it.
Yes.
If you have scheduled jobs, then you typically have the submitter, the deployer, have authorizations to use a functional account and then schedule the job, and when it runs under this functional account. Do you have any comments on how that is migratable, those constructions to VIA 4? Probably that is possible, of course, but do you have any experience with that kind of migrations?
So, I mean, I'll say that with all of the, command line submission, the Connect submissions, you're still running that batch server, Connect server as the identity of your client. So that's not changing. Does your question extend beyond that?
The concern is, I think, mainly about the scheduled jobs that run under a functional account.
Yeah. I think, like with Airflow, I think there are just functional accounts that are used by Airflow to run. I know we have one customer I work very closely with. They schedule all of their SAS Studio flows under a functional account, and that's how the compute server gets brought up, and then the results are returned back to Airflow.
Okay, so you would typically do that at an Airflow level then?
If you want to add to that for
I'll take
user
another one.
ID migration or something.
Yeah. So basically what you do is, if you want to schedule jobs under a centralized account, that's again something that you can specify on the, in this case I think it's the launcher context. So the launcher context has an option called run server as, and there you can specify a centralized account to run your jobs under. And so when you then use, for instance, Airflow would specify, okay, this is a job that needs to run on this specific context, and that would make sure that it gets launched under a centralized account. The default context will indeed, like Cheryl said, will just use the identity of whatever it is calling that batch CLI. So if you authenticate as yourself, the job would run as your own identity.
And then a deployer can be authorized to use a certain launcher context that specify these functional accounts. Correct.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. That sounds good. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
Jan.
you.
Jan is a
Thank you.
peer on my
Yeah.
team, so we work
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, we also make use of that a lot.
We have a question up here, and then I think I saw a hand in the back, maybe.
It's a great presentation. So I have
Thank
one
you.
question related to auto scaling. So is there any limitation on the licensing for the course that they can use capacity, how much they can use with auto scaling?
So I will mention two things. With our hosted managed services, we don't yet support auto scaling. That's if your VIA deployment is hosted by our SaaS cloud organization. We are in the process of adding support for auto scaling. Beyond that, it's whatever you.
So if I use
What?
AWS public cloud, so
Yeah, no, there's no limit.
there's no limit. So my follow-up
I
question.
mean, you need to remember, you're paying for cloud resources
Right, I
as you
got it. I
scale
get that
out,
one,
and so
yeah.
you want to make sure, you're scaling back. And SWO does a lot to monitor the amount of workload on the scaled out nodes, so that it doesn't continually place new jobs out there if the other nodes, have space, so that it will scale back.
Okay. My follow-up question is, if there is no limit for auto scaling, so can you limit by a particular job so it can only use these many, this much capacity or these many parts or something like that?
You can, because you can control the amount of scaling on your host type definition, and then you would use a queue so that job has a requirement of using that host type.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I don't want user jobs to be using unlimited, but I
Right.
want some bad jobs where critical jobs can be
Yes.
used.
Yes,
as
so you would have a critical queue that had as a requirement, a resource requirement, a scalable host type, and they would always go to that host type and be able to scale.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We have a 9.4 M8 grid environment and thousands of PPM jobs are running. Suppose if you want to move to VIA 4, how we can move those PPM jobs to VIA 4? I think you mentioned using this migration tool. Once administrators move the jobs into VIA 4, is there any, again, users needs to modify those jobs, or automatically we can move from 9.4 M8 to VIA?
So, if I understand your question correctly, I mean, moving your PPM jobs over to VIA 4 would be part of your whole migration. I mean, you wouldn't move just the PPM jobs, platform process manager jobs. You would,
We have to move entire all the jobs.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And then your question is, how can you modify them?
Yeah, because of if it is required, again, users needs to intervene and they make changes those jobs, or is a one-time job, administrators can handle those
Yes.
jobs?
Yes, they can absolutely be modified. I mean, if you're using Airflow, it's a DAG file that can be opened and anything can be modified within that file. If you're using a different enterprise scheduler, then you know how you work with that enterprise scheduler.
Okay.
All the way in he's had his hand up a couple times.
Thank you, Cheryl, for the excellent presentation. So the question that was asked by Subha, he's also part of my team. So, so the scenario that we have is like we do have platform process manager, where we have thousands of jobs, right? So in order for us to do the migration, would you recommend converting the existing PPM jobs into Airflow DAG before we migrate on to the VIA? Because there are thousands of jobs and every job has a different definition and all that. So will the migration utility help convert the jobs from PPM to VIA by itself?
Yes.
Or do we have to do some manual kind of work?
The first thing you said, the migration utility will do the conversion of the PPM jobs over to Airflow DAGs. And it does it by executing a JExport, which dumps the metadata used by Platform Process Manager, and then the tool from the migration team reads and parses all that metadata and knows how to put that together as an Airflow DAG on the VIA side.
Sure, thank you. And my another question is like we do have multiple application server contexts, like SaaS app 1, 2, 3, like that. So in that case, from migrating from SaaS Grid to VIA, like do we need to create separate launcher context for each and everything, like one-to-one mapping from Grid application server context to the launcher context?
Yeah,
do we have to do that way or what?
I think you will want to look at your server context on the SAS 9 side and determine which ones you need and which ones need to map over to launcher context on the VIA side.
So basically, like if all 3 application server contexts are needed as per the design that we have, so we can carry the same design to the VIA as well. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yes.
I have a question for Jan, or maybe you.
All right, you're out. You're out.
Well, to continue on that, when you're doing that context assignment and giving the access, can you do that based on a AD group membership? Yes. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. That you notice when I gave my history, I did not include like security and user ID mapping and things like that. That's why he's here.
Sorry, I came late anyway.
No, it's okay. Oh, okay.
I think we are at time or a little over, so if you have other questions, maybe Cheryl can stick around for a few minutes.
Sure.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Cheryl, for the great presentation, and safe travels.
Thank you.